positive implications of working memory training. Take it away, Joni.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to talk to you all today. So as Nadine said, I'm going to talk to you about working memory, disorders of working memory, and then I'm going to talk to you a bit about working memory training too. So I thought it would be really useful just to start with a very general description of working memory. So coming from Europe and thinking about working memory in a European framework, we tend to work within the Badley and Hitch model of working memory. So I thought it would be nice just to begin with a short description of this model, but also to talk to you about the similarities that we see across different models too. So when we think about working memory, we tend to think of it as being our ability to hold information in mind and to be able to use that information in the course of our ongoing cognitive activities. So it's about holding information in mind and using that information to carry out any kind of mental processing or activity that we're engaged in. Here I've got a theoretical framework of working memory for you. And what we have here in the centre is, very loosely, the Badley and Hitch working memory model. So we have short-term memory stores, so we have stores for remembering and just maintaining verbal information, and we have a store for maintaining visual-spatial information. Then we have this part here called working memory or executive control. This is sometimes called the central executive, and I think it overlaps very nicely with some of the North American models of working memory, where we talk about working memory really being the focus of attention. So although we have different frameworks which might actually characterise working memory and characterise our ability to hold information in mind, what we know is that each of these models tends to assume that there is some kind of higher level attentional control that is supplemented by some kind of temporary maintenance system. So we have higher level attentional control, which might involve processing and storing information, but then we have the short-term memory stores just for maintaining information. This is about as theoretical as my talk will get. I'm going to talk to you mainly about the application of working memory in terms of developmental disorders and also in terms of training. But I thought it might be useful just to start here with these different frameworks. Okay, so what we know about working memory and about disorders of deficits in working memory is that they're common in many different developmental disorders. So what we will find, particularly with children who have disorders such as ADHD, or specific difficulties in reading, language, or maths, is that these children will typically perform poorly on a test of working memory. So working memory impairments are a common part of many different developmental disorders. And across these disorders, what we see is that impairments in working memory are associated with problems in learning, with problems in paying attention and sustaining attention to a task, and also in following instructions. So many learning situations require children to remember multiple steps of a particular task. What we find is that children who have working memory difficulties often fail to remember multi-step instructions. And you yourselves will know, and many of you are practitioners here today, you probably have an increasing recognition of working memory difficulties. You're increasingly aware that they are common in many developmental disorders, and you're probably increasingly looking for interventions that might be able to alleviate some of the negative consequences of having poor working memory. So there really is an increasing demand for us as researchers and as academics to develop targeted interventions to try to alleviate working memory difficulties. But in order to be able to do this, what we need to do is we need to really understand what is the nature of a working memory impairment. If a child, for example, has dyslexia and they perform poorly on the working memory test, do they have a core impairment in working memory? Should we be targeting intervention at working memory specifically, or should we be looking elsewhere at other cognitive deficits and targeting intervention there? So in order to be able to develop effective interventions to try to improve working memory function, one of the most fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves is whether or not the working memory problem is central and core to the child's disorder or the difficulties they might be facing. We also need to think about when we're actually developing working memory interventions, so for example, thinking about maybe working memory training, we need to think about whether or not it's going to be useful for every child who has a working memory problem. So here I'm going to talk to you in the second part of my talk today about whether or not working memory profiles, so the kind of baseline profile of a working memory child might actually predict response to intervention, and I will be focusing on working memory training. Okay, so I'm going to take each of these two questions in turn. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about whether or not working memory problems are caused to the different developmental disorders in which we see working memory difficulties. So are working memory problems a core problem? And I think to think about this, we need to really understand working memory in its broader cognitive context. So here this is a model I presented to you earlier, where we have the working memory system in the centre. So we have a short-term memory store for verbal information, a short-term memory store for visuospatial information, and we also have the executive control of working memory. This entire system will only function effectively if the information that is coming into it is well represented. So what this means is that the quality of your working memory, or the efficiency of your working memory system, relies on good, adequate input. Whether that be the quality of the phonological information coming in, or the quality of the visuospatial information coming in. We also know that at the other end of the working memory system, so thinking here about the executive control of working memory, we do know that this overlaps and is involved in many other executive functions. And the talks this morning really touched upon this very nicely. So we know that the executive control of working memory is very highly correlated with selective attention, inhibitory control, with planning, and with other executive functions too. Okay, so if we're thinking about where the source of a working memory impairment might come from, there may be three different routes to a working memory problem. So imagine you're working with a child, you run a working memory test with them, and you actually now decide that this child is performing very poorly on the working memory test. You now need to understand, is it a genuine working memory problem, or is it a consequence of a difficulty elsewhere in the broader cognitive system? So if a child performs particularly poorly on a verbal, short-term memory or verbal working memory test, you might be picking up on a genuine working memory problem. Alternatively, you might find that the child is performing poorly on that test because they have a difficulty in phonological processing. What this will mean is that there is an impairment to the information as it enters the working memory system, and this then causes the child to perform poorly on any test that relies on adequate phonological representation. So it might not be a genuine working memory difficulty that you detected. It may well be a consequence of difficulties in processing phonological information. You might, of course, have picked up on a genuine working memory impairment, and this would probably show up as being a child being impaired on both verbal and visuospatial or non-verbal tests of working memory. Or if you did see that profile of what we would call domain general working memory impairments, you might actually be picking up on a broader difficulty in executive functions or in higher order cognitive control. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we do look for working memory deficits in children, we do think about how we might want to develop interventions, and what we need to do is to be able to understand what might be the source of that working memory difficulty. This is something that we've become very interested in our research group in Cambridge. I work there with Darren Dunning, who's here today, and with Sue Gather-Cole, who I'm sure many of you know. And we're very interested in trying to develop ways in which we can actually identify the source of working memory problems. And we've been developing a diagnostic instrument to do this. Now, it's very much in the beta phase, but I thought it might be nice to present it to you here today so you get a feel for the kind of things that we're doing. So this is an online assessment, so it contains 12 different tasks, and we've developed this assessment battery to be able to measure what we call the component processes that are associated with working memory. So in the working memory diagnostic instrument, we have tests of phonological and visuospatial processing. So here we can measure how well the child can deal with this information outside of the context of a memory task. We have short-term memory tests. So these are just measuring the child's ability to remember something that they've either seen or heard. So it's just about recalling information that's seen or heard without manipulating it in any way. So here we use digit span to measure verbal short-term memory, and we use a Corsi block task to measure visuospatial short-term memory. We also have backward versions of these tasks. So a backward digit recall task and a Corsi task in which the child remembers a sequence of locations that are lit up in backward order. And these are actually actually assessments of working memory. Because here the child is not just maintaining information, they're having to reverse the order of it prior to recall, so therefore we've involved an explicit processing element to the task. We've also included complex span tasks. I don't think I really need to explain these too much to you because Jason did a great job of that before lunch. So these are tasks in which there'll be some items to remember. So in the case of the verbal tasks, we have the child remembering a sequence of digits. In between the presentation of each of those digits, we get them to engage in a verbal processing task. In this case, we're actually doing a lexical decision task with them. So they would hear a number, so for example 6, then they would engage in a period of processing where a series of words would appear on the screen and they have to decide if they're real words or not. And you'd have another item, which here would be 8, then another period of processing, and then they have to recall the numbers in order at the end. So we've got complex span tasks there, and we have a visual-spatial equivalent as well. So here the storage items are the locations, and then the processing decision is to judge whether or not the pattern is the same within those two shapes. So what you will probably notice, and hopefully have noticed, is that the processing and storage elements of these complex span tasks are actually the composite of doing the processing on its own and the storage on its own, and the two tasks feed into these complex span tasks. We've also included verbal and visual-spatial tests of selective attention, and we're using flanker tasks, and we've also included Stroop tasks to get a measure of inhibitory control. So we've been developing this battery of assessments so that we can try to identify the source of working memory difficulties. It's very much in the beta phase. We are actually carrying out a large factor analytics study with children and with adults using this assessment tool. And we've also been using it with different developmental groups. So I just wanted to present to you today some of the data that we've got from working with a group of children who have poor language skills. So here we used the diagnostic instrument, so we administered these 12 tasks to a group of children who had very low levels of receptive and expressive language. And we compared their performance to a non-verbal ability matched control group, and they were age matched to them as well. And what I've got here is I've just got the effect sizes shown on each of those tests. So along the top we've got the verbal tasks, and along the bottom we've got the non-verbal or visual-spatial tasks. These in red here are where the differences between the two groups were actually significant. So when we ran those 12 tasks with a group of children with language problems, what we found is that they were actually significantly impaired relative to the comparison group on a phonological processing test and also on a test of verbal short-term memory. So although we commonly think that verbal working memory difficulties are present in children with language problems, using this diagnostic tool, we've been able to see that actually their relatively poor verbal working memory performance is likely to be a consequence of both a verbal short-term memory and a phonological processing deficit. And we've been using this kind of approach because we're very interested in intervention. We're very interested in particular in working memory training. And using this kind of approach, we think we might actually be able to help people to decide carefully about the kind of intervention they might want to use. So in the case of these particular children, we might think, well, okay, they have a working memory sort of weakness compared to a typical child of the same age. But really, do we want to actually invest in working memory training, which focuses on improving this aspect here? Or do we maybe want to think about targeting intervention here, where the real deficits are? So this is something that we're taking forward, and we have quite a large program of research that we're doing at the moment. I'm not going to talk to you too much about that, but I just wanted to highlight to you the general approach that we're taking. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to actually talk to you about working memory training. So we are interested in identifying the cause of working memory problems, but we're also very interested in trying to remediate working memory difficulties. And this is because irrespective of what might be the cause of the working memory problem, we do know that working memory difficulties pose a substantial barrier to learning in the classroom. So for this reason, we've been very interested in working memory training. It's been touted out in the literature as a really good solution and a good way to try and boost working memory performance. We've been using working memory training now for many, many years. We started back in about 2006, 2007. We've run a lot of training studies with lots of different groups. I'm going to really pull together now what we think about it from our own data in terms of whether or not training is effective. And I really will pick up on some of the themes I think that Jason mentioned before lunch. So working memory training typically involves training for multiple sessions on working memory tasks that are constantly adapting to match the participant's actual, current level of working memory performance. So as the participant moves through the training programs and their working memory is apparently increasing, they're able to retain more information, the tasks adapt and become more difficult, and they actually increase the working memory load, so there's more and more items to remember as the person gets better. Training normally takes the form of one of three different paradigms. So you either have training on NBAT tasks, and Jason again described these earlier very nicely for us, and we all kind of appreciated how difficult these tasks looked. So in these tasks you have a stimulus that will appear on the screen one at a time, and your job is to judge whether or not the stimulus that's on the screen matches one that you maybe saw 1 back, 2 back, 3 back, and so on. So in this verbal NBAT task here, we have letters appearing on the screen one at a time. It's a 2-back task, so the participant is asked to actually respond when the stimulus on the screen matches one that was presented 2 back. In terms of the visuospatial NBAT tasks, you can have this kind of task here, which involves them actually judging whether or not the current location that's lit up on the screen matches one that was presented 2 back. Then we have complex band training tasks. So these are the tasks that Jason's group's used here. We've done some studies ourselves using very similar tasks to these. I won't explain the paradigm to you because hopefully you can remember it. And then you have tasks such as those that are included in the CogMed type batteries, where we're actually looking at serial order training. Now I'm going to just focus on these here because in many of our studies we have used CogMed's training product. In particular with our developmental groups we've used CogMed. So in these kinds of activities, participants are presented with a series of either verbal tokens, such as digits, or they're presented with visuospatial non-verbal items. They either recall them in the order in which they were presented, or in backward sequence. Sometimes for the visuospatial tasks, there might be a mental manipulation in terms of, for example, the objects moving around on the screen prior to recall. But they all involve some element of serial order recall. So in this one here, this is a backward digit recall task. The participant might hear 3 numbers, 2, 5 and 8, and they have to click into the keypad the numbers in reverse order. So they would click in 8, 5, 2. In this task here, we have asteroids that are moving around the screen. This is one of the visuospatial tasks. As these are moving around the screen, the participant watches them light up one at a time, and whilst they're still moving, has to click on them in the correct serial order. So in the same order in which they lit up. So there are 3 different approaches to training. We've tended to use the serial order approach. We have also done some training with complex band tasks as well. And what I thought I would do here is just kind of take a bit of a segue and tell you a bit about what we think about working memory training in its current form. So is working memory training effective? So Jason actually spoke to you about this earlier on. And I think he probably convinced you that there's probably some merit in working memory training, but maybe that we need to go a bit further and to refine it in some way. Now, our research group really does agree with this perspective. We're very much in line with Jason's thinking. So what we've found in our studies generally is that if you train on working memory tasks, you get better on other untrained working memory tasks. Okay, so you get what we would term near transfer. This graph here summarises the data from one of our own randomised control trials. So here we use working memory training with children who have poor working memory. Children were randomly allocated to the adaptive training group, so this was our main intervention group. They were allocated to an active control group, so this was a non-adaptive version of the memory training. So in every task, every time they trained, there were only ever 2 items of information to remember. Or we had a passive control group who had no intervention. We assessed them before and after on a range of standardised memory tests. We had tests of verbal short-term memory, so just recalling what they'd heard. We had visuospatial short-term memory, so recalling something that they'd seen. These had no explicit processing in them. And then we had verbal and visuospatial working memory tasks. So these required the participants to do something with the information as well as maintain it. These bars show you the change in standard scores from before training to after training, or from pre to post assessment. If you look at this, you can see that for verbal short-term memory, we found very little response to training. And that's something that we pick up quite a lot in our studies. When we look at putting people through these serial order training paradigms, there's very little effect for verbal short-term memory. For the other three aspects of working memory that we assessed, we found there were significant gains across the board on those three assessments for the children who were in the adaptive group. So this is showing you here that we get significant improvements in these three aspects of working memory following training. And these are untrained tasks. In this study, we also administered 20 different assessments of learning. So we had standardised assessments of language, we had IQ assessments, we had mathematics assessments, reading assessments. We also had a set of tasks that we designed to mimic the kinds of classroom activities that children engage in that load their working memory. So, for example, measuring their ability to follow sequences of instructions. What we found in this study is that there was no impact of training on any of those assessments, neither immediately after training nor at a 12-month follow-up point. And this is something that we've replicated in many studies. So we find improvements on untrained tests of working memory, but we don't find much evidence for far transfer. So do we think that working memory training can cure working memory problems? Well, I think from our own research group's perspective, we think that because training gains are somewhat restricted to tasks that are very similar to the training activities, we're not actually fundamentally changing the efficiency of working memory. We don't typically see benefits for classroom activities that depend on working memory, nor do we see improvements in reading or maths abilities, nor in behaviour measures such as measures of inattention that we know also rely on working memory performance. What we think that training might be doing, though, is actually improving the children's skills and strategies that they use to complete working memory tasks. So I think one of the questions that came up this morning was, does training actually provide people with the opportunity to learn how to learn? And we ran a study very recently. It was with a group of undergraduate students. And we asked them before and after training what kinds of strategies they were using to complete different working memory tasks. And what we found was that there was actually a significant increase in the number of people who reported using strategies such as rehearsal and grouping. We also found a similar effect with children. So after training, we asked children, oh, how do you think you got better? And they would say things, oh, well, I just learned to say the numbers over and over in my head so I could remember them. So what we think that training might be doing is, rather than fundamentally altering the capacity of working memory, it might actually be providing people with the opportunity to develop compensatory skills and strategies that they're then able to use to boost their performance on the trained tasks, but also on untrained tasks that share very similar features with the training activities. And this may be one reason why we don't get far transfer, because people aren't spontaneously applying those skills and strategies outside of the training environment or beyond tasks that are very similar to the trained activities. Okay, so far hopefully I've talked to you a little bit and told you a bit about two different lines of work that we've been involved in. One is trying to understand the cause of working memory difficulties across different developmental disorders. One of them is looking at working memory training and really trying to understand whether or not if we use training, we can boost learning outcomes. And I think at the moment, the state of the field is that we can't really use it to boost learning outcomes, but there may be something in the training that we can use and adapt and take forward. In another line of work that we're carrying out, we're very interested in understanding whether or not baseline working memory profile might actually predict response to working memory training. So although the ultimate goal of using working memory training might be, for example, to improve learning outcomes, we still need to be able to demonstrate that we get near transfer in order to take it forward to try and promote far transfer. So in one of our programs of work, we're very interested in understanding whether or not the different working memory profiles that we see across different developmental groups might impact on how useful working memory training might be in improving performance on untrained working memory tasks. So what we know know is that different profiles of working memory impairment are related to different patterns of learning difficulties. And we want to know if these different profiles might impact on the utility of working memory training. So to begin with, I'm just going to talk to you here now about the different working memory profiles that we see across different patterns of learning difficulty. So if we consider a working memory profile that is actually reflected by domain general impairments in working memory. So here I'm talking about impairments on both verbal and visuospatial working memory tasks. Children who have this profile of working memory impairment are typically those who have an ADHD diagnosis or children who have poor working memory. So here we have some data from one of our own studies in which we were looking at the working memory profiles of children who had ADHD and children who had poor working memory. And we compared them to a control group who had no working memory impairments and no symptoms of ADHD. What we found is that for both children with low working memory and ADHD, their verbal short-term memory performance was in the average range, but they were actually significantly impaired on both verbal and visuospatial working memory tasks. So they had domain general impairments, and these also reflected some kind of impairment or poor performance on visuospatial short-term memory tasks as well. Now what we know in children is that actually tests of verbal visuospatial short-term memory are highly associated with tests of working memory because they're very attentionally demanding. So we think that picking up on this kind of impairment here is just part of the difficulty we see in verbal and visuospatial working memory. So in this study, what we found really is that children who have ADHD, children who have poor working memory, are typically impaired in both verbal and visuospatial working memory tasks. If we now consider a different working memory profile, so these are children who have impairments just in visuospatial working memory tasks, what we see is that this profile of working memory impairment is most commonly associated with specific difficulties in mathematics. This is some data from Danish Success group. So this is another research group in Cambridge. They compared children with specific maths problems to a control group, and they used a wide range of different tests. You don't really need to concern yourself with the complexity of this graph. I just wanted to use it to illustrate that children with maths difficulties are significantly impaired relative to controls on visuospatial working memory tests, but there's no significant difference on verbal working memory tests. If we look at the opposite profile, so now we're going to turn to children who have a profile of verbal-only working memory impairments. This kind of profile is very common among children with disorders of language. So the kinds of children that you're probably very familiar with working with yourselves. We see that profiles of verbal-only impairments in working memory are most common in children with specific reading difficulties and also in children who have specific language impairment. This graph is just adapted from one of Sue Gadicol's papers just to illustrate to you here that verbal short-term memory and verbal working memory are often significantly impaired, with visuospatial tests of working memory actually in the relatively average range. So what happens when we put children with these different working memory profiles through training? Most of our studies have been with children with poor working memory or with children with ADHD. And we get this pattern of response where actually they improve on visuospatial short-term memory assessments and on both verbal and visuospatial working memory tasks. So they had domain general impairments in working memory. After working memory training, we see that both verbal and visuospatial aspects of working memory respond to training. So it seems to be quite effective in improving aspects of working memory in which they're impaired. We became very interested in trying to understand whether this was also true for other developmental groups, so for other children who are characterised by different profiles of working memory impairment. And what I thought I would do today, because it's a conference looking at working memory training and at language, is talk to you about the study in which we were interested in specifically looking at whether or not working memory training could boost performance on untrained working memory tests in children with poor language skills. So it's part of a broader programme of work that I've been talking to you about. And here we know that children who've got low language ability are typically impaired on verbal short-term and working memory tests, but they do have this very domain-specific impairment in working memory. We were very interested in knowing whether or not training could boost performance on verbal aspects of memory in this group. So do we see improvements in verbal short-term memory? Do we see improvements in verbal working memory? Because these are the areas that are most impaired. So in this particular study, we set about trying to identify a group of children who had low language performance. We screened 222 children who were aged 8 to 10 on a receptive and an expressive language test, and we also took a measure of non-verbal IQ. We excluded any children who had English as an additional language, so we actually had just monolingual children in this study. We were able to identify 16 children who had significant impairments in the two language tests. We didn't control for verbal IQ, but we did match them to a comparison group on a measure of non-verbal ability. So we had relatively small sample sizes, and in fact we ended up with 12 children who were poor language learners and 15 children in a comparison group. This is just to explain to you their screening profile. So here we're looking at recalling sentences. So you can see here the screening sample were done on average in terms of scaled scores, as were the comparison group, but you can see there was a significant impairment in the low language ability, which was also picked up on the Peabody test that we also administered. But when we looked at matrix reasoning, you can see that the sample as a whole was at the normal level, and we had low average non-verbal IQ for our comparison group and our low language ability group. So these weren't an SLI group, they were just a group of poor language learners who we compared to a group of children who did not have language impairments, but who were matched in terms of non-verbal ability. We looked at their working memory profiles before training, so here we were using the standardised assessments that I've talked to you about previously. When we compared the two groups, we found they were only significantly different before training on verbal short-term memory tasks. They were not different on the visuospatial tasks. There was something of a difference between the groups here on the verbal working memory measure, but it didn't reach significance. So when we corrected for using multiple tests, we didn't find this difference here was significant. So we then put the two groups through working memory training. After training, this is the effect that we found for our comparison group. So we saw that they improved from pre-test to post-test on visuospatial short-term memory assessments and on verbal and visuospatial working memory assessments. So they showed a pattern of response that was very similar to the children who we had seen previously who have ADHD and who have low working memory. And in fact, it's a pattern of response that we see in typically developing children, and we also see it in adults too. So this group was showing very much the normal pattern of response to training. When we looked at the low language ability group, we found something quite different. So we found that they improved on the visuospatial short-term memory tasks as well. They also seemed to show a small but significant improvement in verbal short-term memory. So this is not something we typically see, and it is the area that was most impaired for this group before training, and you can see that actually after training they did seem to improve in this area. We then compared the groups directly. So here we're looking at whether or not the pattern of response to training might be mediated by their baseline profile. So here, is the response of the comparison group the same or different to that of our children with language impairments? What you can see is that when we actually looked at composite scores, so we had multiple assessments here, there were no significant differences in how the two groups responded to training. When we broke it down by task, however, we saw that our low language ability group made significantly greater gains on one of the tests of verbal short-term memory than our comparison group. In contrast, the comparison group seemed to improve to a significantly greater extent on a verbal working memory task, although when we corrected for multiple comparisons, this difference didn't actually withstand that. So in fact, the only difference we found when we compared the two groups, when we looked at it by task, was that the children with poor language skills seemed to improve to a significantly greater extent than a comparison group on a verbal short-term memory test. So what does this start to tell us? If we start to think about it in the broader picture of what we've been doing with other developmental groups and thinking about what we know about the profiles of these groups before training, what we can say at this point is that children who have domain general impairments in working memory before training seem to show gains in both verbal and visuospatial untrained working memory tests. For children who seem to have specific impairments in verbal short-term memory, so here the low language group I've been talking to you about, they seem to show actually a beneficial effect of training for verbal short-term memory. We know that verbal short-term memory is particularly important for vocabulary learning, and it would be interesting for us to follow these children up to see if we get any impact in terms of improvements on measures of language ability. We have 2 other studies that are ongoing at the moment, and we're just in the recruitment phase here, where we're looking for children who have verbal working memory impairments. Here we're looking for children with reading difficulties. We want to see what their pattern of response to training might be. Is it greatest, for example, for verbal working memory? And we're also doing the same for children who have visuospatial working memory problems. So here we're recruiting a group of children with specific maths difficulties. And based on the data that we have so far, we might expect that you actually get benefits for areas that actually are showing the greatest deficits before training. Okay, so I just want to pull together those 3 different strands of work that I've been talking to you about today. We know that working memory impairments are common. We see them in many different developmental disorders. What we're thinking is that it's very vital now for us to understand whether or not those working memory impairments are actually a core feature of these different developmental disorders, or whether they're a consequence, for example, in difficulties of associated processes such as phonological processing or broader difficulties in executive function. We think that it's very important to understand this so that we're able to develop effective interventions that target the core area of deficit. This is going to involve careful and proper assessment of the cognitive skills of children with these different disorders. And in fact, in our own research group, we're starting to try and move away from using diagnostic labels such as dyslexia, ADHD, SLI, and instead we're trying to look at cognitive phenotypes. So we're looking at this in terms of working memory, but we will also be looking more broadly at other cognitive skills. And we think this is important because we have some data now coming through in the other line of research that we've been running that seems to suggest that working memory phenotype, so baseline working memory profile, might be important in terms of looking at how effective different interventions might be, and particularly in how effective working memory training is. In terms of thinking about working memory training, is it effective? I think the message really from our own data is that existing training methods seem to be somewhat limited. You get improvements on tasks that are similar to those on which the children have trained. And that's no great surprise. If you practice at something, you are likely to get better at it. We think we get near transfer because people are actually able to develop strategies that help them to improve on similar tasks. But actually, to get what we would call functional transfer, so to get gains and improvements that have an impact in everyday life, we think we need to take what we know about training and push it forward and develop new methods. And one of the key things that we're very interested in, which is a new line of research that Darren Dunning is leading, is trying to develop new working memory training paradigms in which we actually embed the training activities in everyday tasks that load working memory. So you get improvements on tasks that are very similar to the trained activities. So we think now we need to move the working memory training tasks into the actual activities that depend on working memory in everyday life. So, for example, embedding working memory training in maths, in reading, or in language tasks. We think we obviously need to carry out a lot more research. We need to talk to practitioners and other researchers across the world so that we're actually able to capitalise on other people's knowledge about the kinds of activities that they think load working memory. And I hope that over the next day or so we'll have the chance to do that with many of you in the room here. Okay, so just to finish, I'd like to thank Sue Gallico and Darren Dunning, who have been very heavily involved in this research, and to thank all of our funders as well. Thank you.
Time for questions. I'm not sure how to phrase this. This kind of goes back to the beginning of your talk when you talked a little bit about the models. And, there were 3 routes to a verbal working memory impairment, or working memory. And one of them was the quality of the phonological, I think you said representation, or phonological input.
Yeah.
Can you expand on what that means exactly? What is a poor quality phonological representation? Or
I suppose at the simplest level of explanation, it would be if the child is processing phonological information poorly, it means the information entering into the memory system is so degraded that any representation or recall of that information is going to be impaired because the information that entered the system was impaired.
Okay, so and the model is one that really does separate the language and the storage system.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, so you've got different elements all feeding through to each other.
Okay. So I think towards the end of your talk, you started to bring them closer together, talking about training.
Absolutely, yes.
Verbal working memory to improve language. So,
yeah.
And in the adult domain, that's the point of view that I take. So I was just wondering how it's. So could you expand on that last point a little bit?
Yeah, okay, so I think that what we have been doing is actually separating out these processes and saying, okay, where's the impairment, where do we want to target intervention? And I suppose from one point of view, you could say, well, if phonological processing is all about the information coming into the system, maybe we need to improve that to have a knock-on cascading effect across the broad cognitive system. But when we look at what we have been doing with working memory training, we've not been doing that, we've just been focusing on working memory. And rather than running multiple interventions where you might do one hoping for an effect on the other, we are actually thinking now we need to integrate it as a whole in terms of intervention packages and try and hit the system, you know, as
it works.
Yeah, as it works together, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
That's a great talk, thank you. I'm a little surprised to hear that there are no far effects of training. Am I not remembering your 2009 study showing far effects in mathematics, and that's been replicated, as well as other studies showing enhanced reading comprehension and following working memory training?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So I think in individual studies you do see some improvements. In our 2009 paper we found a small but significant impact on maths. We didn't actually have a control group of follow-up there, and the effect came through 6 months later, so we couldn't actually control the effects of retesting. In our, I guess, you get these small effects, you get individual studies where you do see file transfer, but I think broadly looking across the literature and trying to see do you get replicated and consistent, reliable effects, that's much weaker evidence. So I think the data that Jason presented was really nice. When you pull together the meta-analyses, yeah, there might be some evidence for it, but I don't think it's something we would rely on from our own data say that we get. So the randomized control data that I presented to you is the most rigorous study that we've run. It was a double-blind randomized control trial. It had nearly 100 children in the study, and we didn't find any impact on learning at all, so we found no file transfer in that study at all. So maybe in some of our less well-controlled studies we had small effects, but we don't seem to have been able to replicate it ourselves. So I guess my honest opinion is that I think at the moment existing methods probably are a bit limited, and we maybe need to work hard at trying to improve them. But I don't think the story, I don't think it's doomed. I think there's, you know, some measure in taking working memory training.
I'm afraid I may have missed it sitting to the back. Your working memory training, did it affect, did you target particular components of executive functions as well? It was domain general, but did you target like the verbal and spatial sort of memory or the other ones? That's the first part. And then when you test again, did you find improvements and changes in any of the other executive functions?
So the training that we use, it actually targets both verbal and visuospatial working memory. So when I'm talking about domain general, I mean we're using short-term working memory tasks that have verbal and visuospatial stimuli. When we look at if there are any changes in other executive functions, in the studies that we run, we found no transfer. So we see no improvements in street tasks or blank tasks.
My question is for you, but it's for anyone who's presented, I think. I know that you're finding near transfer. I'm curious as to whether you've done longitudinal studies and whether this transfer lasts over long periods of time.
Yeah, in our randomized control trial, we followed the children up 12 months later, and we saw the gains on the untrained verbal working memory tasks were still there. So we saw an improvement of about 1 standard deviation in scores, so 15 standard score points, and that was maintained 12 months later. So it does seem to be sustained, yes.
Thank you. I have a very practical question. I am a speech technologist, and for those of us in the room that do behavioral therapy. So I can appreciate working memory and its effects, and I felt that for quite a while, and this all is very encouraging. you know, in an IEP or working with adults, because I do both, you're going to get 1 to 2 sessions a week possibly. And I do working memory training in conjunction with the other, but I'm sort of on the fence now because I feel like is there any kind of efficacy in that one, you know, in that little bit that they're getting, we hope to get things to transfer at home. The one thing I have noticed with the adults that when I'm getting them and they're saying, you know, they can't remember the sequence to remember to push off the chair without their walker. I have seen it working, this is no study, but I have seen it working with some working memory tasks. First of all, they enjoy them. They first think, oh, this is so easy. I'm a National Nurse Society 50, 60 years ago. But I see that an awareness, if nothing else, and that could be very subjective. But I've seen awareness come to be that I have to be more in tune with those, you know, things that I am doing and how I perceive my ADLs because what I used to do isn't working anymore.
Yeah.
So that's a benefit I see. But I mean, as far as employing this working memory therapies and whatnot into a functional, just our therapies that we're doing once a week or so. I mean, what do you think?
So I suppose there's two parts to that. I think in our training studies, we've run quite a lot of training studies now with different groups. We administer them sometimes a couple of times a week, and it takes a long time to get through a 20-session protocol. Sometimes we have people who do 5 times a week and they get through it really quickly. In our experience, the frequency of administering the training doesn't have an impact on the effects. So it doesn't really matter if you do it over 20 weeks or 4 weeks. It seems to have the same kinds of effects. And in terms of talking about the awareness that you described, that people become very aware of how they have to focus a bit more, they become a bit more in tune with what they're doing and how they're actually compensating. This is something we think is quite important with memory training. So I talked a bit about the strategy study we ran, and it really confirmed what we'd noticed when we were working with children and adults, is that they do then realise things such as, well, grouping the information or just having this increased awareness of how they can compensate for where they're struggling. And we think that existing training methods don't provide any practice in how you might reflect on that development or have any kind, they don't have any meta-awareness or meta-cognitive components to them. So one way which we're trying to take the training forward is working with different groups and actually including an element of metacognitive training on the side. So really getting people to reflect actively on how they're developing new methods and new strategies, and then actually providing them with real life practice in the applications of those skills and strategies. So it's interesting that you mentioned it. I think it's a really key component of these training programs.
Thank you very much.